The mid to late 20th century sought out many new possibilities for the aviation industry and was the big break for many famous defunct legacy carriers, such as Pan Am or Eastern Airlines. One of the most famous carriers at this time was Transworld Airlines, or TWA as it was better known as. TWA was one of the most famous former legacy carriers that struck their fame in the 1960s through the 1970s. Unfortunately, the airline faced its shocking downfall in the 80s and 90s, along with the drastic events of 9/11, causing the straw to break the camel's back and resulted the airline to merge with American Airlines on December 1st, 2001, which didn't surprise people at all at that point. So how exactly did an airline so successful have such a terrible demise? The history of TWA began on October 1st, 1930 with the merging of Transcontinental Air Transport, Western Air Express, Maddox Airlines, Standard Airways, and Pittsburgh Aviation Industries Corporation to form Transcontinental and Western Air, or TWNA. The airline began operating short domestic flights to and from their hub in St. Louis, Missouri. But, unfortunately, just a year after their startup, TWA suffered their first accident when one of their Fokker F-10s crashed in Chase County, Kansas, after a structural failure caused the aircraft to crash, killing all 6 passengers and 2 crew members. 3 years later, in 1934, the airline was renamed to what it is mainly known as today, Transworld Airlines. As the 1930s went on, newer airlines such as United, American, Eastern, and Pan Am became a monopoly in the aviation industry, which resulted in them being dubbed the Big Five. In World War II, TWA did their part by allowing the U.S. Air Force to convert their 5 Boeing 307 Stratoliners into strategic airlift planes for the Air Transport Command, or ATC. The airline also did the same thing with their Douglas DC-4s and Lockheed L-49 Constellations. After the war, TWA began expanding their fleet for the next 2 decades with newer Lockheed aircraft such as the Constellation and the Starliner. On January 29, 1959, the airline received its first jet aircraft, the Boeing 707, with services beginning on March 20, 1959, with the San Francisco to New York.
TWA is the only airline that flies throughout the United States and to Europe, Africa, and Asia. On TWA, you fly with pilots who fly the world. Only Transworld Airlines links 70 cities in the USA with 15 world centers over.
In the 1960s, the airline began to phase out their turboprop airplanes and replace them with mainly 707s and Convair A80s. In 1961, TWA became the first airline to use in-flight entertainment systems on their flights. However, Howard Hughes' leadership of TWA was questioned by a lawsuit by Charles Tillinghast for violations of the Sherman and Clayton Antitrust Act. This lawsuit lasted for 5 years until Hughes and the Hughes Tool Company lost control of TWA and the airline then became publicly owned. These lawsuits would continue for almost 3 decades until 1993 when a $35 million settlement was made by Carl Icahn. Going back to April of 1964, the first of many 727s were delivered along with their first of their DC-9s 2 years later. In the early 1970s, Transworld Airlines introduced their first wide-bodies to the fleet, the 747 and the L-1011 TriStar. The 747 introduced non-stop New York to Paris Orly on April 13, 1970, with some of the airline's greatest services.
Our new 747. Somehow, you feel more important on TWA.
Things were looking great for the airline's future until the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978. Because of this, the airline's decline began. The airline then started to consolidate its route system on its domestic hubs in St. Louis. In 1983, TWA created their parent company called Transworld Corporation, and TWA also sought to buy out Hilton Hotel, but the airline was already losing money as it was by its aging fleet and rising fuel and maintenance costs, dropping their stock. In 1985, TWA's board agreed to sell their airline to Frank Lorenzo's Texas Air Corporation. Because of the airlines that were in the corporation, TWA decided to break the deal. In 1986, TWA got an enormous fleet expansion by their merger with Ozark Airlines, which gave them a lock on their St. Louis hub. In 1990, Carl Icahn tried to sell TWA's England routes to American Airlines for $455 million, which later became successful. That same year, the airline tried to acquire Pan American World Airways for $450 million, but Pan Am ultimately rejected the offer and decided to sell their London routes to United Airlines. 2 years later, on January 31, 1992, the airline filed for a pre-packaged bankruptcy. Employees for the airline averted this by agreeing with the airline's terms. Under this deal, Icahn was forced to resign as CEO and forced to pay the airline $150 million. The airline was then finally able to emerge from its bankruptcy on November 3, 1993, and move their headquarters from Kansas City, Missouri to Mount Kisco, New York. TWA created a ticket agreement in 1995, which allowed excluded tickets for travel that originated or terminated in St. Louis, Missouri. Just 2 years after their first bankruptcy, the airline went into it again numerous times in 1995. On June 30th of that year, they filed for bankruptcy again, but luckily were able to come out of it in August. Even after this, the airline still had $1.3 billion in debt to pay off. In early 1996, TWA announced that they would place orders for the Boeing 757 to replace their older 727s to modernize their fleet. On July 17, 1996, TWA suffered one of their most horrendous accidents when TWA Flight 800 exploded in midair while on a flight from New York to Paris, killing all 230 people on board, which to this day is one of aviation's biggest controversies. Hours before this happened, TWA had gained $28.5 million in the second quarter of that year, which hadn't been that high since 1989. Just like Pan American's fatal fall after Flight 103, TWA took that same jarred turn after Flight 800. TWA then proceeded to lose $14.3 million in the third quarter of that year. The following year, in 1997, the airline made major changes by closing most of their domestic JFK flights, grounding their 747s, and suspending services from New York to Frankfurt to Athens. That same year, Russian airline Zero was considering buying the airline, but later reconsidered the idea. From 1997 to 1998, TWA retired all of their L-1011s and 747s. For the next 3 years, the airline continued to struggle financially until April 2001, when American Airlines proposed a $2 billion merger between the two. TWA formally accepted the offer and filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy for the third time in the airline's history. On December 1, 2001, N948TW, named Wings of Pride, conducted the final flight for TWA from Kansas City to St. Louis as Flight 220. The airline officially merged with American Airlines on that same day. The question is, though, how exactly did the airline take such a sharp turn towards defunctness? Well, for starters, the airline was facing quite hardships from the Deregulation Act of 1978, as well as other issues such as the disaster of Flight 800 and their financial problems in the 1980s following the deregulation, which caused them to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy twice in the 1990s. So it's almost as if the airline had been suffering from financial ruin for over 23 years. However, the legacy of the airline is carried on throughout aviation. American Airlines fulfilled the legacy of TWA by painting one of their 737-800s in the airline's dual-stripe livery that was one of the most famous liveries of the airline. The TWA Flight Center, one of the old terminals at John F. Kennedy Airport, became the TWA Hotel, which opened on May 15, 2019. The hotel offers some vintage features of the airline and an excellent view of JFK Airport. Thank you all for watching. If you found today's video interesting, please consider liking and sharing the video. Also, be sure to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. If you feel that there were any important details about the airline that I missed, please leave them down below in the comments. Alright, that's gonna do it for today, guys. I'll see you in the next one.